Welcome to our deep dive into Baron Dolbeck. Really a fascinating figure of the Enlightenment. You're coming to this with a philosophy background, so we can really dig in, beyond just the surface level. I mean, it's almost like he led two lives. This radical atheist philosopher writing these, scathing critiques of religion. And at the same time, he's this charming socialite hosting these lavish dinners with, like, all the brightest minds of Europe.
It's what makes him so captivating, right? You
Yeah.
have this figure who's bridging this radical fringe of the Enlightenment and then the cultural mainstream. Figures like Diderot, Rousseau, even Benjamin Franklin were at these gatherings.
Wow.
It was really a crucible of ideas that helped shape, the intellectual landscape that ultimately led to the French Revolution.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine someone who held such seemingly like disparate views being so popular. It speaks to a certain charisma, and I don't know, maybe they're like a strategic sense of how to bring radical ideas into the mainstream a little bit. But let's dive into the philosophy itself. His most famous or infamous book, System of Nature, lays out a pretty bold claim. I mean, for the time. The universe is just matter in motion, no God, no soul, pure cause and effect.
It was a direct challenge to the prevailing views at the time. And what's so intriguing is how he builds this materialistic view of reality. He draws on some familiar figures like John Locke, but takes things in a very different direction.
Right. Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities, the idea that things like color and taste only exist in our perception, not in the object itself, that was a big deal.
Absolutely. But Holbach takes this concept of matter and he expands it in a very fascinating way. So he agrees with Locke that matter has these fundamental qualities, these universal qualities. But there's more to it. Different types of matter can have these unique properties that aren't just reducible to the basic building blocks. Kind of like how a diamond and a lump of coal, they're both made of carbon.
Right.
But their structures and properties are vastly different.
Right.
For Holbach, matter as a category is much more diverse and complex than we might initially think.
That's where it gets really interesting, for someone with a philosophical mind.
Hmm.
Because if matter itself has this inherent variety, it opens the door to explaining things like thought and consciousness in purely material terms.
Exactly. He's essentially saying that we don't need a separate immaterial soul to explain these things. So thought, feeling, even consciousness, these could just be emergent properties of certain complex arrangements of matter. He refers to matter as a genus of beings with this wide range of properties, some shared, some unique.
It's a much more nuanced take on materialism than just saying, everything is atoms bouncing around. It's almost like he's anticipating some of the later developments in science about emergent properties arising from complex systems.
Yes, and this has major consequences for how he understands everything from human nature to ethics and politics. It's all interconnected.
Okay, so we have this foundation of like a robust, complex materialism. Where does that lead him in terms of how we should live, how we should organize society? Because it's almost surprising that with such a radical view of the universe, his ethics seem pretty traditional on the surface.
It's one of the most intriguing things about him. He talks about happiness, self-preservation. These are the fundamental drives of human behavior. You might expect a staunch materialist to end up with a very stark, like, survival of the fittest kind of morality.
Right, like if we're just biological machines, why bother with ethics at all?
But Holbach makes this case for ethics being not just desirable, but essential. And it's precisely because we are driven by these basic impulses. He sees virtue as the most rational, effective way to achieve happiness and well-being, both for ourselves and for society as a whole.
So it's not about being good because God commands it, but being good because it ultimately serves our own self-interest, like a kind of enlightened self-interest.
Precisely. He argues that if you understand how the world works, how human nature operates within this material framework, you'll naturally gravitate towards virtues like temperance, moderation, justice. They're not arbitrary rules. They're actually strategies that lead to a more stable and fulfilling life, individually and collectively.
It almost sounds like he's building a system of ethics from the ground up, starting with this understanding of human nature as part of the natural world, governed by the same laws as everything else.
And that's what makes it so fascinating. He's trying to ground ethics in something that is solid, observable, and understandable, without resorting to, like, supernatural or mystical explanations.
Yeah. But if religion is out of the picture, how do we arrive at a shared understanding of these virtues, of what constitutes a just and flourishing society? That seems like it would be pretty crucial for his whole system to work.
Yeah, that really is the question, isn't it? I mean, if our morality is not derived from divine command, then where does it come from? Like, how do we as, material beings living in a material world arrive at this shared understanding of right and wrong, of what a good life is or what constitutes a just society? And this is where Holbach's political philosophy really comes in, I think.
So this is where we get to his autocracy, right? This idea of a society governed by ethical principles. It sounds very intriguing, but I'll admit it, a bit utopian, at first glance.
Yeah, it might seem that way initially, but remember Holbach wasn't like a naive idealist or anything. He understood that humans are complex, capable of great things, but also prone to selfishness and short-sightedness. And his autocracy isn't about creating a perfect society, but rather a framework, I think, for channeling our natural impulses towards a more just and harmonious way of living together.
Okay, so how does that actually work in practice? What are the nuts and bolts of this ethical framework?
Well, for Holbach, it starts with recognizing that our individual pursuit of happiness is ultimately intertwined with the well being of others.
Right.
We're not isolated atoms just bouncing around. We're social creatures. Our flourishing depends on the flourishing of the community. I mean, he was very clear about that. A just society needs to reflect this interdependence.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like that old saying, no man is an island. We can't truly achieve happiness in isolation. We need each other.
Exactly. And this leads to some key principles, I think, for how an theocracy would actually function. First, he places a huge emphasis on education. He believed that a well-informed citizenry is absolutely crucial for a healthy society. People need to understand their rights, their responsibilities to each other, the principles that underpin a just and functioning government.
So it's not just about leaving individuals to pursue their own happiness however they see fit. There's a role for, like, collective action, institutions, a system that cultivates and guides this pursuit of the common good.
Absolutely. Education for Holbach is the antidote to superstition, prejudice, and dogma. These were all things that he saw as major roadblocks to individual and societal progress. And remember, he's writing in a time when, religious authority still held a lot of sway over people's lives.
Yeah. Given his strong materialist stance, I can see why he'd be wary of those kinds of non-empirical belief systems. So education, it's not just about acquiring knowledge. It's also about fostering a certain way of thinking,
Mm.
a commitment to reason, logic, evidence-based decision-making.
Precisely. He wanted citizens who could think for themselves, critically evaluate information, and make decisions based on reason and a concern for the well-being of all, not just their own narrow self-interests.
That's a pretty tall order. It
Yeah.
seems like it requires like a pretty optimistic view of human nature to believe that people are capable of consistently acting in such a rational and selfless way.
Well, he certainly had faith in the power of reason to guide human behavior. But it wasn't just blind faith. He believed that this capacity for reason was itself a product of our material nature. It was something that could be nurtured and cultivated through education and experience.
Okay, so education is one pillar of his autocracy. What else did he see as essential for building this kind of ethically driven society?
Well, another key element was a legal system rooted in reason and justice, not arbitrary power or tradition. He was very adamant that laws should be clear, impartial, applied equally to everyone regardless of their social status.
So rule of law, not rule of men, to use that old phrase. It sounds like he's laying the groundwork for a system very much like modern democracies, where the law is supreme, everyone is accountable to it.
Yes, and I think that's part of what makes him so relevant today. We're still struggling with these same questions. How do we create a just legal system? How do we ensure that laws are fair and applied equally?
Yeah, it's like he was anticipating some of the fundamental challenges of modern governance. But how did he envision this legal system actually working within the framework of his autocracy? I mean, laws are one thing, but how do you get people to actually follow them? Especially if you're not relying on religious authority or, like, the threat of divine punishment.
Right, and that's where his understanding of human motivation comes into play. Remember, he believed that happiness and self-preservation were our primary drives, right? So the key is to create a system where following the law, acting ethically, is seen as the most rational and effective way to achieve those goals.
So it's about aligning individual self-interest with the common good. If people believe that following the law is in their own best interest, they'll be more likely to do it. But that still requires a certain level of trust in the system, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and that trust needs to be earned, right? He really stressed the importance of transparency and accountability in government. If people can see that the laws are fair, that they're being applied consistently, that the government is acting in the best interest of the people, then they're more likely to cooperate.
It's like a social contract in action. Individuals agree to follow the rules in exchange for the benefits of living in a safe and just society. But that contract can be broken, you know, if the government abuses its power or fails to uphold its end of the bargain.
Yeah, you're hitting on a very important point. Holbach was very clear that the government's legitimacy rests entirely on its ability to secure the well-being of its citizens. If it fails to do so, if it becomes tyrannical or oppressive, then the people have a right to resist, even to revolt.
Wow. So he's not just advocating for a system of laws. He's also acknowledging the potential for those laws to be unjust and the right of the people to challenge them. That's a pretty radical idea for the 18th century.
It was indeed radical. He saw the right to revolution not as like an invitation to chaos, but as a safeguard against tyranny. It's a reminder that power ultimately resides in the people and that governments are accountable to them.
That's a powerful concept and one that has obviously had a huge impact on political thought.
Yeah.
But it also raises some tricky questions, doesn't it? I mean, who decides when a government has crossed the line? Who gets to determine when revolution is justified?
Yeah, those are the kinds of questions that political philosophers are still grappling with today, right? And I think Holbach would be right there with us, engaged in the debate, trying to find the balance between the need for stability and order and the right of the people to hold their leaders accountable.
It's fascinating to see how these seemingly abstract ideas about ethics and politics are ultimately grounded in his materialist view of the universe. It all comes back to that fundamental understanding of human nature as part of the natural world.
Exactly. He was trying to build a system of ethics and politics that is consistent with what we know about ourselves as material beings living in a material world. And I think that's what makes his work so relevant today, right? We're still struggling with these same questions about how to create a just and flourishing society. And Holbach's ideas offer us this really valuable framework, I think, for thinking about these issues.
It's like he's saying, okay, here are the basic facts about human nature. Now let's figure out how to build a system that works with those facts, not against them.
And that's a really powerful insight. But to fully appreciate the depth and complexity of his thought, we need to dive a little deeper into his ideas about the social contract. So he actually outlines a two-stage theory that helps to explain how we move from this state of nature to a well-functioning society.
This is where he diverges a bit from someone like Locke, right? I'm curious to hear how he lays this all out.
Well, the first stage of his social contract theory is pretty straightforward. It's the agreement between individuals to form a society for mutual benefit and protection. And this is based on the recognition that we're stronger together, that cooperation, mutual aid are essential for survival and well-being.
Right, it's that classic idea of leaving the state of nature, where everyone is fending for themselves and entering into civil society, where we agree to abide by certain rules in exchange for the security and benefits of living in a community.
Exactly. And Holbach emphasizes that this social contract is ongoing, unbreakable. It's the foundation of any civilized society.
Okay, so that's the first stage.
Yeah.
But then how does the government fit into all of this? I mean, I'm assuming it's not just a free-for-all with everyone doing their own thing within the society.
You're right. That's where the second stage of his social contract comes in. And this is the contract between the society as a whole and the sovereign power, the government. This is where we establish the mechanisms for creating and enforcing laws, protecting individual rights, and promoting the common good.
So it's like we're delegating certain powers to the government in order to ensure that the social contract, between individuals, is upheld and that society functions smoothly.
Precisely. And here's the crucial part. For Holbach, the legitimacy of this government, its right to wield power, rests entirely on its ability to fulfill its end of the bargain. So the government derives its authority from the consent of the governed, and its primary duty is to secure the well-being of its citizens.
So no divine right of kings.
Yeah.
No arbitrary authority. Power flows from the people and is contingent on serving their interests.
Exactly. And that's what makes his political philosophy so radical for its time. He's arguing that the government is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. And that end is the happiness and well-being of the people that it governs.
That's a remarkably modern idea, and one that we often take for granted today. But back then, it was truly revolutionary to assert that the people are the ultimate source of political authority.
Yeah, it was a direct challenge to the prevailing view that monarchs derive their power from God. And it has profound implications for how we understand the relationship between individuals and the state.
Yeah, it's really amazing to see how he lays this groundwork for so many ideas we just take for granted in modern political thought. But thinking about the context, that he was writing in, it must have seemed so radical. It's almost like he's like peering into the future, outlining these principles for a system of governance that wouldn't fully come into being for like centuries.
I know it's part of what makes studying figures like Holbach so rewarding, right? You see these seeds of thought planted centuries ago, and they take root, and they ultimately help shape the world we live in.
It really makes you realize how ideas can have a profound impact. But speaking of historical context, I'm curious, how do you think Holbach would view our modern world? Like, especially with all the scientific advancements that have happened since his time.
Oh, that's such a fascinating question to consider. I mean, remember, he was writing at a time when Newtonian physics was the cutting edge of scientific knowledge. Like, imagine if you introduced him to things like quantum mechanics, relativity,
Yeah.
our our modern understanding of the vastness and complexity of the universe from, modern cosmology.
Right. It's almost like trying to imagine someone from the Middle Ages being transported to our time.
Hmm.
The sheer amount of knowledge we've accumulated about the universe since Holbach's day it's incredible.
It really is. I think on the one hand, he'd be absolutely thrilled by these advancements. I mean, he was such a passionate advocate for scientific inquiry, for using reason and observation to understand the world. He'd probably see modern science as a vindication of his core beliefs about the material nature of reality.
You're like, see, I told you so. The universe is governed by natural laws, by cause and effect. We just needed time to figure it all out.
Exactly. But at the same time, I think even he would find some of the implications of modern science challenging. Maybe even a bit unsettling, right? Like quantum mechanics, with its probabilistic nature and the strange behavior of particles at the subatomic level, that seems to really undermine the strict determinism that was so central to his philosophy.
Yeah, so even though the universe is still ultimately material, the way that matter behaves at its most fundamental level is so much more complex and counterintuitive than he could have ever imagined.
Yeah, and I think that's where his concept of matter as this genus of beings might come into play. Remember, he argued that different types of matter could have unique properties, not just reducible to like these simple building blocks. So perhaps he would see these strange quantum phenomena as evidence of the inherent diversity, like the richness of the material world.
Right? You'd be like, okay, maybe I didn't get all the details right, but the fundamental principle still holds. The universe is made of stuff, and that stuff can behave in some pretty mind-bending ways.
And I think he would have been particularly fascinated by the advancements in neuroscience. He was so interested in understanding the human mind. And he really believed that thought and consciousness were ultimately products of material processes in the brain. So imagine what he would make of our modern understanding of neurons, synapses, brain chemistry, and how they all work together to produce our subjective experiences.
Right? It's like we're finally starting to uncover the mechanisms by which matter gives rise to mind, those qualities that once seemed so mysterious, beyond the reach of scientific explanation.
Exactly. He might even see it as like the ultimate validation of his materialist philosophy. But it also raises these new questions, these new challenges. For example, if consciousness is truly an emergent property of complex brain activity, then what are the implications for free will and moral responsibility?
Right? It gets back to that age-old debate.
Hmm.
If we're just biological machines, albeit incredibly complex ones,
Mm.
are we really free in our choices, in our actions? Or are we just playing out some predetermined script dictated by, the laws of physics and chemistry?
Those are the questions that philosophers are still debating to this day. And I think Holbeck would be right there with us, eager to engage in the discussion. He might have been forced to revise or refine some of his earlier views, but I suspect he would have held on to this core belief that we are ultimately responsible for our actions, even if those actions are ultimately determined by our material nature.
Yeah, it's like he's saying, look, even if we don't have some kind of magical free will, we still have to live in this world and make choices. And those choices have consequences, both for ourselves and others. So we might as well try to make the best choices that we can based on reason, compassion, and our understanding of, the common good.
I think you've really captured the essence of his thought. He was a pragmatist at heart, someone who was deeply concerned with building a better world, even if that meant confronting some uncomfortable truths about human nation and the universe that we inhabit.
It's a perspective that's both challenging and inspiring. He reminds us that we need to be intellectually honest, in our understanding of the world, but also morally committed to creating a more just and humane society.
Well said. And I think that's a fitting tribute to the legacy of this fascinating and often controversial figure from the Enlightenment. Baron Tolbach may have lived centuries ago, but his ideas continue to resonate with us today. He challenges us to think deeply, to question our assumptions, to engage in reasoned debate, and to strive for a world where reason, ethics, and a concern for human well-being guide our actions.
Well, it's been an incredible journey exploring his ideas. For anyone listening who wants to learn more, I highly recommend diving into some of his original works. You'll be amazed at how relevant and insightful they remain, even after all this time.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. There's a real richness to his thought that goes beyond, like, the simple summaries you often find in textbooks. He was a complex thinker, grappling with some of the most fundamental questions about human existence and the nature of reality.
And that makes him a perfect subject for a deep dive like this. Thanks for joining me on this exploration.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Always happy to delve into the world of Enlightenment thought.